In the family photo, my sister pushed my autistic son and said loudly, "A child like that only brings shame." Nervous laughter echoed through the room. Seconds later, my son stood up and said something that silenced the room. Everyone was in shock. The moment had been building all afternoon during our annual family Christmas gathering at Mom and Dad's house. Dylan, my 8-year-old son, had been doing remarkably well considering the overwhelming sensory environment. 23 relatives crammed into the living room, children shrieking with excitement over new toys, adults talking over each other in competing conversations, and the constant flash of cameras documenting every forced smile and staged interaction. "Let's get one more picture with all the grandchildren," Mom had announced, her voice carrying the particular strain that suggested this family gathering was testing even her legendary patience. "Margaret, can you help arrange them on the couch?" My sister Emma had immediately taken charge, as she always did during family events, positioning her own 3 children, perfectly behaved, neurotypical kids who understood social expectations instinctively, in the center of the frame. Dylan had been sitting quietly on the far end of the couch, gently rocking back and forth in the self-soothing motion that helped him manage overwhelming situations. "Dylan, sit still for the picture," Emma had commanded with the authoritative tone she used for all children, as if autism was a behavioral choice rather than a neurological difference. "Stop that weird rocking thing. You're ruining the photo." "He's doing fine," I'd said quietly, moving closer to provide Dylan with the reassurance of my presence. "The rocking helps him feel calm." But Emma had apparently decided that Dylan's accommodations were interfering with her vision of the perfect family photograph. Without warning, she'd reached over and physically grabbed Dylan's shoulders, stopping his rocking motion and positioning him according to her preferences. "A child like that only brings shame," she'd said loudly enough for the entire room to hear, apparently frustrated that Dylan's autism required any accommodation at all during family activities. "Can't he just act normal for 5 minutes?" The nervous laughter that had rippled through the room came from relatives who were uncomfortable with Emma's cruelty, but unwilling to confront her directly. They'd all learned over the years that challenging Emma's pronouncements led to dramatic confrontations that could ruin entire family gatherings. But Dylan had stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and precise, in the way that suggested he was processing complex information rather than having an emotional reaction to his aunt's cruelty. "Aunt Emma," he'd said in the clear, careful voice he used when he had something important to communicate, "I know about the pills you hide in your purse. I know about the phone calls you make when you think nobody can hear you. I know about the man who comes to your house when Uncle David is at work." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Every adult in the room had frozen, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, confusion, and growing understanding of what Dylan had just revealed. Emma's face had gone white, then red, then white again as she'd apparently realized that my shame-bringing autistic son had just exposed secrets she'd thought were safely hidden from family scrutiny. "Dylan, go upstairs to the quiet room," I'd said gently, recognizing that he'd reached his limit for social interaction and needed space to decompress from both the overwhelming environment and the confrontation he'd just initiated. He'd nodded and walked away with the measured pace he used when he was carefully managing his sensory input, leaving behind a room full of adults who were staring at Emma with expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension. "What did he mean about pills?" Mom had asked quietly, her voice carrying the particular concern that suggested she was beginning to piece together information she'd been missing. "What man?" Dad had added, his tone sharper as he'd apparently connected Dylan's revelation to observations he'd made but hadn't previously understood. Emma had looked around the room desperately, searching for someone who might help her deflect or deny Dylan's accusations, but finding only faces that reflected growing awareness that my 8-year-old son had just revealed family secrets that explained months of troubling behaviors and suspicious circumstances. "He doesn't know what he's talking about," Emma had said finally, her voice lacking conviction even as she'd attempted damage control. "He's autistic. He gets confused about things he thinks he sees or hears." But the adults in the room knew Dylan well enough to understand that his attention to detail and memory for conversations were actually enhanced rather than impaired by his autism. When Dylan reported something he'd observed, it was typically accurate to a degree that neurotypical people found remarkable. "Dylan sees and hears everything," I'd said quietly, finally understanding why my son had been increasingly anxious during recent family gatherings. "He processes information differently than other children, but his observations are usually more accurate than ours, not less." The family photo session had ended abruptly, with everyone suddenly finding reasons to be in different rooms, leaving Emma alone on the couch where she'd pushed my son and called him a source of shame. But Dylan's revelation had transformed the family dynamic in ways that would take hours to fully understand, and weeks to completely process. The child who supposedly brought shame had just exposed the family member whose behavior was actually shameful. The 30 minutes following Dylan's revelation felt like watching a family slowly disintegrate in real time. I'd found my son in the upstairs guest room, where we always retreated when he needed to decompress, sitting cross-legged on the bed with his noise-canceling headphones and the weighted blanket that helped him feel secure when overwhelmed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" I'd asked, settling beside him on the bed with the careful movements that indicated I was available for conversation, but not demanding interaction. "Too loud downstairs," he'd replied without opening his eyes, his voice muffled by the headphones but clear enough for me to understand. Aunt Emma was mean. I said true things about her secrets. The simplicity of his assessment, that Emma had been mean and he'd responded with truth, captured the moral clarity that often characterized Dylan's understanding of social situations. He didn't manipulate or deceive. He observed, processed, and reported what he'd seen with the kind of honest directness that made adults uncomfortable. "Yes, Aunt Emma was mean to you," I'd agreed. "And yes, you told true things. Are you worried about what might happen now?" Dylan had nodded slightly, a gesture so subtle that someone who didn't know his communication patterns might have missed it entirely. "People are upset. Loud voices downstairs. Uncle David's car in the driveway now." I'd listened carefully and realized he was right. I could hear David's voice joining the conversation downstairs, apparently having been summoned from wherever he'd been spending his Christmas afternoon. The tone of the discussion had shifted from shocked whispers to increasingly heated confrontation. "Dylan, how long have you known about Aunt Emma's secrets?" I'd asked gently, trying to understand the scope of what my 8-year-old had been observing and processing without telling anyone. "Long time," he'd replied, finally opening his eyes to look at me with the serious expression he wore when discussing complex topics. "Since Uncle David stopped smiling at family dinners. Since Aunt Emma started bringing different purses and checking her phone in the bathroom." The level of detail in his observations was remarkable, but not surprising to me. Dylan's autism had enhanced certain aspects of his perception and memory, making him exceptionally attentive to patterns, changes, and inconsistencies that other people might overlook. "Were you planning to tell someone about what you'd noticed?" I'd asked. "Was waiting for right time," Dylan had said, his response revealing that he'd been carrying this information as a burden, rather than simply observing it passively. "Aunt Emma said mean things about shame. She has real shame secrets." The moral framework Dylan was applying, that someone who accused him of bringing shame while hiding genuinely shameful behavior was being hypocritical, demonstrated the kind of ethical reasoning that many people assumed autistic children couldn't manage. A soft knock on the door had interrupted our conversation. "Sarah, can I come in?" Mom's voice carried a combination of concern and confusion that suggested the downstairs situation had reached a breaking point. "Come in, Mom," I'd replied, watching Dylan put his headphones back on to signal that he was done with social interaction for the time being. Mom had entered looking like she'd aged 5 years in the past hour. Her carefully styled hair was disheveled, her Christmas outfit was wrinkled, and her face reflected the kind of exhaustion that came from having family certainties suddenly overturned. "Emma's gone," Mom had said without preamble. David confronted her about what Dylan said, and she admitted to having an affair with someone from her office. She's been taking anxiety medication that she's been hiding from David, and apparently the relationship has been going on for months. The information hit me like successive physical blows. Emma's cruelty toward Dylan had been projection. She'd been calling my son shameful while engaging in behavior that actually violated family values and marriage commitments. "Where's David now?" I'd asked. "He left too. Took the kids to his mother's house and said he needs time to think about what this means for their marriage." Mom had sat down heavily in the chair by the window, looking out at the driveway where 2 fewer cars were parked than there had been an hour earlier. "And how's the rest of the family handling this? Everyone's pretending to focus on cleaning up from dinner, but really they're all trying to process what just happened." Mom had looked toward Dylan, who was now lying on his side with the weighted blanket pulled over his head. "How did he know all those things? How long has he been watching and understanding things we missed completely?" The question reflected a common misunderstanding about autism that even well-meaning family members often held. The assumption that Dylan's different communication style meant he was less aware of social dynamics, rather than more perceptive about them. Dylan notices everything, Mom, I'd explained. He sees patterns and changes that we miss because we're distracted by our own emotions and assumptions. He's been watching Emma's behavior and David's reactions for months, probably understanding their marriage was in trouble before they fully realized it themselves. But he's only 8 years old. Chronological age doesn't determine emotional intelligence or observational skills, I'd replied. Dylan processes information differently, but that doesn't mean he processes less information. If anything, his attention to detail makes him more aware of things like inconsistencies in behavior or changes in family dynamics. Mom had been quiet for several minutes, apparently trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew about Dylan's capabilities with the evidence that he'd been functioning as the family's most perceptive observer. Emma called him shameful, Mom had said finally, her voice heavy with newfound understanding. But he was the only one who was honest about what was really happening in our family. The conversation with Emma came 3 days later, when she'd finally responded to my texts, requesting that we talk about what had happened during the family photo incident. She'd agreed to meet at a coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where we could discuss her behavior toward Dylan, without the pressure of family audience or domestic distractions. Emma arrived 20 minutes late, looking like she hadn't slept since Christmas Day. Her usually perfect makeup was minimal. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater instead of the carefully coordinated outfits that normally expressed her commitment to maintaining appearances. Before you say anything, she'd begun without even sitting down, I want you to know that I'm getting help. I've made an appointment with a therapist, and David and I are going to try marriage counseling if he's willing to work through this. I'm glad you're getting help, I'd replied honestly, though I was more concerned with understanding her motivations than with her recovery plan. But I need to talk to you about what you said to Dylan, and why you thought it was acceptable to treat him that way. Emma had finally sat down, gripping her coffee cup with both hands like she was trying to warm herself against a chill that came from inside, rather than from the December weather. I know what I said was terrible, she'd said, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the busy coffee shop. I've been feeling like such a fraud lately, pretending everything in my life is perfect while it's actually falling apart. When I saw Dylan being himself, just authentic and unfiltered, it made me angry, because I've been pretending to be someone I'm not for so long that I'd forgotten what honesty looked like. The explanation was more psychologically sophisticated than I'd expected, but it didn't excuse her behavior toward my son. Emma, Dylan didn't choose to be autistic, and he certainly didn't choose to be the target of your frustration about your own life, I'd said, trying to keep my voice calm, despite the anger that had been building for days. He's 8 years old, and he was just trying to cope with an overwhelming social situation when you decided to use him as a scapegoat for problems he had nothing to do with. I know, Emma had replied, tears starting to form in her eyes. I know it was inexcusable. I've been jealous of how patient you are with him, how you always put his needs first, how you've built your entire life around making sure he feels safe and supported. The admission of jealousy was startling. You've been jealous of my relationship with my autistic son? I've been jealous of how clear your priorities are, Emma had clarified, apparently recognizing how her statement had sounded. You know exactly what matters to you. Dylan's well-being, his development, his happiness. I've been so focused on maintaining the appearance of success that I lost track of what actually matters to me. Emma had gone on to explain that her affair had started 6 months earlier, with a colleague who'd paid attention to her feelings and made her feel valued in ways that her marriage had stopped providing. The anxiety medication she'd been hiding was for panic attacks that had started when she'd realized her deception was becoming unsustainable. David's a good man, she'd continued, but our marriage became more about presenting a successful image than about actual intimacy or connection. We spent so much energy making sure everyone thought we had the perfect family that we stopped working on actually having a happy family. And you decided that Dylan was somehow responsible for making your life look less perfect? No, that's not... Emma had paused, apparently realizing that her explanation was revealing motivations she hadn't fully acknowledged to herself. Maybe I've been so focused on controlling how our family appears to others that anyone who couldn't perform normalcy felt like a threat to the image I was trying to maintain. The honesty was painful, but helpful for understanding how Emma's priorities had become so distorted that she'd view my autistic son as an obstacle to family perfection rather than as a beloved nephew who deserved accommodation and support. Dylan doesn't perform normalcy because he is normal, I'd said firmly. His normal just looks different from your normal. The problem isn't his autism. The problem is your assumption that difference equals shame. Emma had cried for several minutes, apparently processing the implications of what I was saying, about how her values had led her to treat both her own family and mine. How did he know about my secrets? She'd asked finally. How could an 8-year-old understand things about my marriage that I thought I was hiding successfully? Because Dylan pays attention to details that other people miss, I'd explained. He notices when your behavior changes, when your routine is different, when you're carrying extra stress. He's not trying to spy on you. He's just naturally observant about patterns and inconsistencies, and he remembered everything he'd noticed. Dylan has an exceptional memory for things that seem important to him. If he sensed that your behavior was connected to family tension, he would have paid extra attention and remembered what he observed. Emma had been quiet for a long time, apparently trying to understand how her 8-year-old nephew had been functioning as the family's most perceptive observer, while she'd been dismissing him as a source of embarrassment. I owe him an apology, she'd said finally. Yes, you do. But more than that, you owe him respect going forward. Dylan deserves to be treated as a valued family member whose differences are accommodated rather than criticized. Understanding Dylan's perspective on the family photo incident required the kind of patient conversation that could only happen when he felt completely safe and unrushed. 2 days after my coffee shop meeting with Emma, I'd found him in his bedroom, arranging his collection of colored stones in patterns that seemed to follow some complex organizational system that made perfect sense to him. Can we talk about Christmas at Grandma's house? I'd asked, settling on the floor beside him, but not disrupting his stone arrangements. Dylan had continued organizing stones for several minutes before responding, a processing time that I'd learned to respect, rather than interpret as ignoring me. Aunt Emma was angry before she pushed me, he'd said finally. Her breathing was fast, and her hands were making fists. The level of detail in his observation was characteristic of how Dylan processed social situations, by attending to physical cues and behavioral patterns that other people might not consciously notice. How did that make you feel when you saw she was angry? I'd asked. Worried, Dylan had replied immediately. When adults are angry at family parties, children get in trouble for things that aren't their fault. His response revealed an understanding of family dynamics that was both sophisticated and heartbreaking. He'd learned to monitor adult emotional states as a survival strategy, recognizing that unpredictable adult behavior could affect his safety and comfort. Were you surprised when Aunt Emma pushed you and said mean things? Dylan had picked up a blue stone and held it up to the light, examining it with the focused attention he gave to objects that helped him think through complex questions. Not surprised about being mean, he'd said after his examination. Aunt Emma smiles with her mouth, but not with her eyes when she talks to me. Been that way since I was little. The distinction between genuine and performed friendliness was something Dylan had apparently been tracking for years, giving him insight into Emma's true feelings that the rest of us had missed. But I was surprised that she said it loud enough for everyone to hear, Dylan had continued. Usually adults say mean things about me when they think I can't hear them. The casual way he delivered this information, the acknowledgement that adults regularly discussed him in ways they assumed were private, made my heart ache for what he'd been carrying alone. Dylan, do adults often say things about you that hurt your feelings? Sometimes, he'd replied matter-of-factly. They think I don't understand when they use words like difficult and challenging and burden. Wah, but I understand those words. I'd wanted to cry at the realization that my son had been silently enduring adult conversations that treated his autism as a family problem, rather than simply a family characteristic that required accommodation. How do you feel when you hear adults saying those things? Dylan had set down the blue stone and picked up a green one, apparently using the transition to help him process emotional questions that were more challenging than factual ones. Sad, he'd said quietly, and confused, because I try very hard to be good and not cause problems, but adults still think I'm too much work. You're not too much work, sweetheart. You're exactly the right amount of work for a mother who loves you. I know you think that, Dylan had replied, with the careful precision he used when making important distinctions. But other adults think different things. I can tell by how they talk to you about me when they think I'm not listening. The conversation had continued for an hour, with Dylan revealing the extent to which he'd been observing and processing adult interactions that I'd assumed were beyond his awareness. He'd overheard relatives discussing the burden of accommodating his needs at family gatherings. He'd noticed when adults excluded him from activities without explanation. He'd been aware of conversations about whether his autism was something I'd caused or failed to prevent. Is that why you decided to tell everyone about Aunt Emma's secrets? I'd asked. Because you were tired of adults saying mean things about you? Partly, Dylan had admitted. but also because it wasn't fair. Aunt Emma said I bring shame, but she was doing things that hurt Uncle David and her children. I don't hurt anyone by being autistic. The moral reasoning behind his decision was remarkably sophisticated. He'd understood that Emma was engaging in projection, accusing him of bringing shame to deflect attention from her own shameful behavior. How long have you been thinking about telling adults what you've noticed about their secrets? Long time, Dylan had replied, but I knew it would make people upset and angry. I was waiting for a time when it felt more important to tell the truth than to keep everyone comfortable. And Christmas felt like that time? When Aunt Emma pushed me and called me shameful in front of everyone, it felt like the right time to show that she was the one doing shameful things, not me. Dylan had returned to arranging his stones, apparently satisfied that he'd explained his reasoning clearly enough for me to understand his motivations and decision-making process. Are you glad you told everyone what you knew? I'd asked. Yes, he'd replied without hesitation. Truth is better than pretending, even when truth makes people uncomfortable. The simplicity and wisdom of his statement had reminded me that Dylan's different way of processing the world often led him to insights that neurotypical people missed in their efforts to maintain social harmony at the expense of honesty. The family meeting Mom had called for the weekend after New Year's was supposedly about healing and moving forward, but it felt more like a tribunal where long-suppressed resentments were finally being aired in Dylan's absence. I'd arranged for him to stay with my friend Lisa's family, knowing that adult conversations about family dysfunction weren't appropriate for him to witness, regardless of his remarkable perceptiveness. We need to talk about how we've been handling Dylan's autism as a family, Mom had announced once everyone was settled in the living room. Christmas made it clear that we haven't been as supportive as we should have been. The conversation that followed revealed patterns of exclusion and resentment that had been building for years. Aunt Carol admitted that she'd been uncomfortable inviting Dylan to her daughter's birthday parties because she wasn't sure how to accommodate his needs. Uncle Mike revealed that he'd been avoiding family gatherings where Dylan would be present because he didn't know how to act around kids like that. It's not that we don't love Dylan, Aunt Carol had clarified, apparently concerned that her admission sounded crueler than she'd intended. It's that we don't understand his autism, and we're afraid of doing or saying the wrong thing. So instead of learning about autism or asking how to help, you've been excluding him, I'd said, finally understanding why certain family events had guest lists that mysteriously didn't include my son. We weren't trying to exclude him, Uncle Mike had protested. We were trying to avoid putting him in situations that might be difficult for him. You were making decisions about what would be difficult for Dylan without asking Dylan or me what he actually needs, I'd replied. And you were doing it based on assumptions about autism, rather than knowledge about my specific child. Dad had been largely quiet during these revelations, but now he'd spoken up with information that reframed years of family interactions. Sarah, we need to be honest about something, Dad had said, his voice carrying the weight of a disclosure that had been delayed too long. When Dylan was first diagnosed, some family members suggested that maybe it would be better if you didn't bring him to large family gatherings. The statement hit me like a physical blow. Who suggested that? It wasn't malicious, Mom had interjected quickly, apparently trying to minimize the damage of Dad's revelation. Some people thought that Dylan might be more comfortable in smaller, quieter settings, and that big family parties might be overwhelming for him. Who specifically suggested that Dylan shouldn't attend family gatherings? I'd asked again, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Emma, who'd been sitting silently throughout most of the conversation, finally spoke up. It was my idea originally, she'd admitted. I thought it would be easier for everyone if Dylan's needs didn't have to be considered when we were planning family events. The admission explained years of subtle pressure I'd felt to decline invitations or leave early from family gatherings. I'd internalized the message that Dylan's presence was inconvenient, assuming that accommodation was my responsibility rather than a family obligation. So for 5 years you've been planning family events around Dylan's absence, rather than including him and making necessary accommodations, I'd said, finally understanding the pattern of exclusion that had made me feel like an outsider in my own family. We didn't know how to include him, Aunt Carol had repeated, as if ignorance was an excuse for exclusion rather than a problem to be solved through education and effort. Did anyone ever ask me how to include him? I'd asked. Did anyone research autism or talk to professionals about accommodation strategies? Or did you just decide it was easier to exclude him than to learn about his needs? The silence that followed had been answer enough. Dylan told me that adults often say things about him when they think he can't hear, I'd continued. Now I understand what conversations he's been overhearing. You've been treating his autism like a family burden rather than a family characteristic that requires understanding and support. Dad had pulled out a notebook that apparently contained information he'd been preparing to share. After Christmas, your mother and I started researching autism and accommodation strategies, he'd said. We realized how much we didn't know about Dylan's experience, and how our ignorance had led to exclusion rather than inclusion. What did you learn? I'd asked, though I was more interested in their willingness to acknowledge past mistakes than in their newfound education. We learned that Dylan's observation skills and memory are probably enhanced by his autism, rather than impaired, Mom had replied. We learned that his need for routine and predictability doesn't mean he can't handle family gatherings. It means we need to provide structure and sensory accommodations. Most importantly, Dad had added, we learned that Dylan has been functioning as the most perceptive member of our family, while we've been treating him like he was unaware of family dynamics. Emma had been crying quietly throughout this conversation, apparently processing the implications of learning that her nephew, the child she'd called shameful, had actually been the family member with the clearest understanding of everyone's behavior and motivations. I want to make this right, Emma had said finally. I want to learn how to be a good aunt to Dylan, and I want to apologize for years of treating him like his autism was a problem instead of just a difference. Apologizing to me isn't enough, I'd replied. You need to apologize to Dylan, and you need to demonstrate through your actions that you understand his value as a family member. The meeting had continued for 2 more hours, with family members making commitments to educate themselves about autism and develop strategies for including Dylan in future gatherings. But the most significant outcome was the acknowledgement that Dylan's shameful presence had actually been the family's greatest asset for understanding truth and maintaining honesty. When I'd picked Dylan up from Lisa's house after the family meeting, he'd immediately sensed that something significant had changed in our family dynamics. His ability to read my emotional state and detect subtle shifts in routine made it impossible to hide that important conversations had taken place in his absence. Family meeting was about me, he'd observed as we'd driven home, his statement delivered with the matter-of-fact tone he used for conclusions he'd reached through careful analysis of available evidence. The meeting was about how our family can do better at including you and understanding your needs, I'd replied honestly, having learned that Dylan responded best to direct communication rather than euphemistic explanations. Uncle Mike and Aunt Carol don't like when I'm at parties, Dylan had continued, apparently connecting current conversations to observations he'd made over years of family interactions. They think I'm too different. The accuracy of his assessment was both impressive and heartbreaking. Despite our efforts to shield him from adult conversations about his autism, he'd clearly been aware of family members' discomfort and exclusion strategies. They don't understand autism yet, I'd explained, but they're going to learn about it so they can be better family members to you. Dylan had been quiet for the rest of the drive home, apparently processing this information through the careful analysis he applied to changes in established patterns. It wasn't until we'd been home for an hour that he'd approached me with questions that revealed the depth of his awareness about family dynamics. Mom, do you want to know what I heard adults saying about me before Christmas? He'd asked, settling beside me on the couch with the weighted blanket that helped him feel secure during difficult conversations. Only if you want to tell me, I'd replied, though I suspected that sharing this information was important for his emotional processing. Dylan had proceeded to recount conversations he'd overheard during family gatherings, his remarkable memory allowing him to repeat discussions with near verbatim accuracy. He'd heard Emma telling another relative that Sarah babies Dylan too much and doesn't prepare him for the real world. He'd overheard Uncle Mike saying that kids like Dylan never really learn to function independently. He'd listened to Aunt Carol wondering whether my obsession with accommodating Dylan's autism was preventing him from developing normally. I understand those words, Dylan had said after sharing these examples. They think I'm broken, and that you're making me more broken by being nice to me. The interpretation was devastating in its clarity. My family had been criticizing not just Dylan's autism, but my parenting approach, suggesting that accommodation and support were harmful rather than helpful. They were wrong about everything, I'd said firmly. Accommodation isn't spoiling. It's providing you with the tools you need to succeed. Support isn't babying. It's recognition that different people need different types of help. I know, Dylan had replied simply, but it made me sad that they thought you were a bad mom, because you take care of me. The revelation that Dylan had been carrying concern for my reputation, in addition to processing criticism of his own autism, was almost more than I could handle emotionally. "Is that why you decided to tell everyone about Aunt Emma's secrets?" I'd asked. "Because you wanted to show that she wasn't qualified to criticize our family?" Dylan had considered the question for several minutes, his processing time extending as he'd worked through complex motivations and decision-making factors. "Partly that," he'd said finally, "but also because I was tired of pretending I don't hear things. Adults talk about me like I'm not a real person who understands what they're saying." "What else did you hear that adults thought you couldn't understand?" Dylan had pulled out a small notebook from his backpack, a detail that surprised me because I hadn't known he was documenting his observations in writing. "I wrote down things that seemed important," he'd explained, opening the notebook to pages covered with his careful handwriting. Uncle David crying in the bathroom at Thanksgiving, Aunt Emma's phone calls in her car during my cousin's birthday party, Grandpa saying he wishes you had married someone who could fix me. Each revelation had been more painful than the last, painting a picture of family members who'd been discussing my son's autism as a problem to be solved rather than a characteristic to be understood and accommodated. "How long have you been writing down things you overhear?" I'd asked. 2 years, Dylan had replied. "Since I realized that adults say different things when they think I can't hear them than what they say when they're talking to me directly." The notebook contained detailed observations about family relationships, financial stresses, marital problems, and health concerns that various relatives had been discussing in what they'd assumed were private conversations. Dylan's autism had made him an inadvertent family historian, documenting secrets and tensions that no one else had been tracking comprehensively. "Dylan, this is a lot of information to carry alone," I'd said, reviewing pages of observations that revealed my son had been functioning as an unpaid family therapist, absorbing everyone's secrets and problems without anyone acknowledging his emotional labor. "I didn't know who to tell," Dylan had replied. "Adults don't usually want to hear about things they said when they thought nobody was listening. But you decided Christmas was the right time to share some of what you knew. Aunt Emma said I bring shame to the family," Dylan had said, his voice carrying a certainty that suggested he'd been building toward this confrontation for months. "I wanted to show everyone who really brings shame. The moral framework he'd applied, that accusations of shame should be examined for accuracy and hypocrisy, demonstrated the kind of ethical reasoning that many people assumed autistic children couldn't manage. But Dylan had managed it perfectly, using his observations to expose the gap between family members' public judgments and private behaviors. The follow-up conversation with Emma came a week later, when she'd asked if she could speak with Dylan directly to apologize for her behavior during the Christmas photo incident. I'd agreed to facilitate the conversation, but only with Dylan's consent and with clear boundaries about what topics would be discussed. "I want to tell Dylan I'm sorry," Emma had said when she'd arrived at our house, carrying a wrapped gift that looked like it had been chosen with careful consideration rather than grabbed hastily from a store display. "Dylan gets to decide whether he wants to accept your apology," I'd replied, leading her to the living room where my son was building an elaborate structure with his favorite construction blocks. "And he gets to ask you questions if he wants to understand why you treated him the way you did." Dylan had looked up when Emma had entered the room, his expression neutral, but attentive in the way that suggested he was assessing the situation and deciding how to respond. "Hi, Dylan," Emma had said, sitting down on the floor near his construction project, but not close enough to invade his personal space. "I came to tell you that I'm sorry for pushing you and saying mean things about you at Christmas." "I know," Dylan had replied matter-of-factly, continuing to work on his building project, while he'd processed Emma's presence and statement. "I was angry about things that had nothing to do with you," Emma had continued, "and I took my anger out on you because I was feeling bad about myself. That was wrong, and I want you to know that I don't really think you bring shame to our family." Dylan had set down his blocks and looked directly at Emma for the first time since she'd arrived, his direct gaze indicating that he had something important to say. "I know you don't really think I'm shameful," he'd said with the calm certainty he used when stating obvious facts. "You think you're shameful because of the secret things you do. You were trying to make other people think I was the problem, so they wouldn't notice that you were the problem." The psychological accuracy of his assessment had made Emma flinch, but she'd maintained eye contact with him while processing his analysis of her motivations. "You're right," Emma had admitted. "I was trying to distract people from my own problems by pointing out your differences. That was unfair and mean." "Yes," Dylan had agreed simply. "It was unfair and mean." Emma had handed him the wrapped gift, which turned out to be a book about different types of rocks and minerals, a topic that aligned with Dylan's current special interests in ways that suggested she'd actually asked someone what he liked, rather than making assumptions. "Thank you for the book," Dylan had said politely, though he'd continued to regard Emma with the careful attention he gave to situations that required ongoing assessment. "Dylan, can I ask you something?" Emma had said, apparently emboldened by his civil response to her apology. "Yes. How did you know about my secrets? How did you understand things about my life that I thought I was hiding from everyone?" Dylan had considered the question for several minutes while examining his new book, apparently deciding how much detail to provide about his observational process. "You changed your patterns," he'd said finally. "Different perfume, different phone behaviors, different ways of talking to Uncle David. When people have secrets, they act different, but they think nobody notices. But how could you tell that my behavior changes meant I was doing something wrong?" "Uncle David was sad," Dylan had replied immediately. "He stopped laughing at your jokes and started looking at you with worried eyes. When one person in a marriage has secrets that make the other person sad, the secrets are usually about hurting the marriage." The sophistication of his reasoning about relationship dynamics was remarkable, revealing that he'd been analyzing family interactions with the kind of systematic attention that trained therapists might apply to understanding marital problems. "Are you angry at me for having secrets that hurt Uncle David?" Emma had asked. Dylan had thought about this question longer than the others, apparently working through complex feelings about family loyalty and personal responsibility. "I'm sad that you hurt Uncle David and your children," he'd said finally. "But I'm more angry that you said mean things about me to hide your own bad behavior." "That's fair," Emma had said, accepting his assessment without defensiveness. "I shouldn't have blamed you for problems you didn't cause." "Also," Dylan had added, apparently not finished with his evaluation of Emma's behavior, "you shouldn't have pushed me. I don't like being touched when I haven't said it's okay." "You're absolutely right about that too," Emma had agreed. "I won't touch you without asking permission first. Is there anything else you want to tell me about how I can be a better aunt to you?" Dylan had returned to his construction project, apparently satisfied that Emma understood both her mistakes and his expectations for future interactions. "Learn about autism," he'd said without looking up from his blocks. "Most adults think they know about autism, but they only know stereotypes and wrong things. If you want to understand me, you have to learn about real autism, not movie autism." "Can you recommend how I should learn about autism?" Emma had asked. "Ask Mom for books and websites," Dylan had replied, "and pay attention to what I actually do instead of what you think autistic kids are supposed to do." The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with Dylan providing Emma with specific guidance about how to accommodate his sensory needs and communication style during future family interactions. By the time Emma had left, she'd received a comprehensive education in autism accommodation from the 8-year-old she'd previously dismissed as shameful. The revelation about Emma's affair had opened floodgates for other family secrets that had been hidden behind facades of normalcy. Over the following weeks, I'd learned about financial problems, health issues, and relationship difficulties that various family members had been managing privately while maintaining appearances of stability and success. But the most shocking disclosure came from Mom during a quiet conversation we'd had while Dylan was at his weekly occupational therapy session. She'd called and asked if we could meet for coffee, her voice carrying an urgency that suggested she had information that couldn't be shared over the phone. "There's something about Dylan's autism that we never told you," Mom had said without preamble once we'd settled into a corner booth at the cafe near Dylan's therapy center. "Something that might change how you understand our family's reaction to his diagnosis." The statement had sent a chill through me, though I'd tried to maintain composure while preparing for whatever revelation she was about to share. "What about his autism?" I'd asked. "When Dylan was first diagnosed, we had him evaluated by multiple specialists because we wanted to understand every aspect of his condition," Mom had continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "One of the evaluations suggested that his autism might be genetic, that someone else in the family might be autistic too. The implication had hit me immediately, though I'd needed her to state it explicitly before I'd allowed myself to process its meaning. "Who?" I'd asked. "Your father," Mom had replied, her words confirming what I'd already begun to suspect. "The psychologist who evaluated Dylan said that some of your father's behaviors and characteristics were consistent with undiagnosed autism in adults." The revelation had reframed decades of family interactions, explaining Dad's rigid routines, his difficulty with social communication, his intense focus on specific interests, and his struggles with changes in plans or environments. "Dad is autistic?" I'd asked, though I was already recognizing patterns I'd never previously understood as neurological differences rather than personality quirks. "Probably," Mom had said, but he was born in 1952, when autism wasn't understood or diagnosed the way it is now. He grew up being told he was antisocial or difficult, not that his brain worked differently. Why didn't you tell me this when Dylan was diagnosed? Mom had been quiet for several minutes, apparently struggling with how to explain a decision that had shaped 5 years of family interactions around Dylan's autism. Your father was terrified that if people knew autism ran in our family, they'd treat Dylan the way they'd treated him as a child, she'd said finally. He was bullied and excluded throughout school for being different, and he didn't want Dylan to experience that kind of rejection. So, instead of acknowledging the genetic connection, you let the family treat Dylan's autism like it was something foreign and problematic. We thought if we kept it private, Dylan would have a better chance of being accepted as just different, rather than being labeled as part of a pattern of family problems. The decision-making process revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how autism acceptance worked, but it also explained why Dad had seemed so uncomfortable with discussions about Dylan's needs and accommodations. Has Dad ever gotten a formal autism diagnosis? I'd asked. No, Mom had replied. He's afraid that having an official diagnosis would affect his work relationships or change how people perceive his capabilities. But hiding his autism has affected his relationship with Dylan, I'd pointed out. Dylan thinks his grandfather doesn't understand him, when actually they probably have more in common than anyone else in the family. Mom had started crying, apparently processing the implications of learning that years of secrecy had prevented Dylan from connecting with the family member who could have understood his experience most deeply. I think you're right, she'd said through her tears. I think your father has been avoiding Dylan because seeing him is like seeing himself as a child, and those memories are too painful to confront. The conversation had continued for 2 hours, with Mom revealing additional details about Dad's childhood experiences and adult coping strategies that clearly aligned with autistic characteristics. He'd been described as a difficult child who was obsessed with mechanical objects and couldn't understand social cues. He'd struggled throughout school with changes in routine and had been labeled as oppositional rather than neurologically different. Would Dad be willing to talk to Dylan about their shared experiences? I'd asked. Not necessarily about autism specifically, but about feeling different and needing accommodations that other people don't understand. I think he'd want to, Mom had replied. But I also think he'd need help processing his own childhood trauma before he could be emotionally available to support Dylan's experiences. As I'd driven home from the coffee shop, I'd realized that Dylan's revelation about Emma's secrets had initiated a chain reaction of honesty that was exposing family patterns that had been hidden for decades. My son's autism wasn't an isolated occurrence. It was part of a family history that included at least one other autistic person who'd been forced to hide his neurological differences throughout his life. Dylan deserved to know that he wasn't alone in the family, and Dad deserved to understand that his grandson's autism was a shared characteristic rather than a burden to be managed. The conversation with Dad came 3 weeks later, after Mom had gradually prepared him for the discussion about autism that would potentially reframe his understanding of both himself and his relationship with Dylan. We'd met at their house on a Sunday afternoon, with Dylan present but engaged in activities that allowed him to listen without pressure to participate in direct conversation. Dylan, Dad had said, settling into his usual chair with the careful movements he used when approaching emotionally challenging topics. Your grandmother tells me that you've been feeling like some family members don't understand you very well. Dylan had looked up from his puzzle, his expression indicating that he was aware this conversation was important, but wasn't sure yet whether it would be helpful or stressful. Some family members think I'm broken, Dylan had replied matter-of-factly. They think autism means something is wrong with my brain. What if I told you that your brain works the same way mine does? Dad had asked, his voice carrying a vulnerability I'd rarely heard from him. Dylan had set down his puzzle pieces and turned to face Dad directly, his posture indicating that he was shifting into focused listening mode. You have autism too? Dylan had asked. I think so, Dad had replied. I was never officially diagnosed because when I was a child, doctors didn't understand autism the way they do now. But I've always noticed things that other people miss. I've always needed routines and predictability, and I've always had trouble understanding social situations. The admission had been delivered with the kind of careful precision that both Dad and Dylan used when discussing complex topics, but I could see the relief in Dad's expression as he'd finally acknowledged similarities he'd been avoiding confronting. Is that why you don't come to my therapy appointments? Dylan had asked with the direct approach he used when seeking information rather than making accusations. Yes, Dad had admitted. Watching you work with therapists reminds me of being a child when adults were always trying to fix things about me that weren't actually broken. Dylan had been quiet for several minutes, apparently processing this new information about family connections and shared experiences. Were adults mean to you about being different? Dylan had asked. Sometimes, Dad had replied honestly. They didn't understand why I needed things to be organized in specific ways, or why I had trouble making friends, or why loud noises bothered me more than they bothered other children. Do loud noises still bother you? Yes, but I've learned to manage it by avoiding crowded places and wearing headphones when I have to be in noisy environments. Dylan had smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun, apparently pleased to discover that someone else in the family shared his sensory sensitivities and accommodation strategies. Grandpa, do you want to see my noise-canceling headphones? Dylan had asked, apparently deciding that Dad could be trusted with information about his coping tools. I would like that very much, Dad had replied. As Dylan had gone to retrieve his headphones, I'd turned to Dad with questions that had been building throughout this revelation. How long have you suspected you might be autistic? I'd asked. Since Dylan was diagnosed, Dad had admitted. Reading about autism symptoms was like reading a description of my own childhood and adult behaviors. But I was afraid that if I acknowledged the connection, people would assume that Dylan's autism was somehow my fault. Or they might have understood that autism is genetic and that Dylan inherited neurological differences rather than developing a disorder, I'd suggested. Dad had nodded, apparently recognizing that his secrecy had prevented Dylan from understanding that his autism connected him to family history, rather than isolating him from it. Dylan had returned with his headphones, and had carefully shown Dad how they worked, explaining the different settings, and demonstrating how they reduced overwhelming sensory input. These would have been helpful when I was your age, Dad had said, trying on the headphones with obvious appreciation for their effectiveness. You can get your own headphones, Dylan had pointed out. Being autistic doesn't stop when you become an adult. You're right, Dad had agreed. I think I'd like to learn more about adult autism accommodations. The conversation had continued for 2 hours, with Dad and Dylan comparing their experiences with sensory sensitivities, social communication challenges, and the need for routine and predictability. Watching them connect over shared neurological characteristics had been both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Heartwarming because Dylan was finally getting to know a family member who truly understood his experience, and heartbreaking because this connection had been delayed for years by unnecessary secrecy. Grandpa, Dylan had said as the afternoon had wound down, would you like to come to my next occupational therapy session? You could learn about accommodation strategies that might help you too. I would love that, Dad had replied, and for the first time since Dylan's autism diagnosis, I'd seen him show genuine enthusiasm about engaging with autism-related activities. But the most significant moment had come when Dylan had made an observation that revealed how much he'd been analyzing family dynamics without sharing his insights. Mom, Dylan had said, turning to me with the serious expression he wore when making important announcements, I think Aunt Emma was extra mean to me because she was jealous that you understand my autism better than anyone understands her problems. The psychological accuracy of his assessment had been stunning, revealing that my 8-year-old son had been functioning as the family's most perceptive therapist, while everyone else had been treating him as the member who needed the most help understanding social relationships. Dylan hadn't just exposed Emma's secrets, he'd identified the emotional dynamics that had led to her cruelty, demonstrating that his autism enhanced, rather than impaired his ability to understand human behavior and family relationships. 6 months after the Christmas photo incident, our family had transformed into something I'd never imagined possible. A group of people who communicated honestly about their needs, accommodated each other's differences, and celebrated neurological diversity rather than treating it as a problem to be managed or hidden. The changes had been gradual but profound. Dad had gotten a formal autism diagnosis and had begun working with an adult autism specialist to develop coping strategies and self-advocacy skills. Watching him learn about his own neurological differences had been like watching someone discover a roadmap for understanding a lifetime of experiences that had never made sense before. I finally understand why I've always been exhausted after social events, Dad had said during one of our monthly family dinners, now carefully planned with sensory accommodations for both him and Dylan. I thought everyone felt that drained by social interaction, but most people don't have to work as hard as we do to process social information. Emma had completed the autism education she'd promised Dylan, and her apology had evolved into genuine advocacy for his inclusion in family activities. She'd become the family member most likely to notice when environmental factors might be overwhelming for Dylan or Dad, and she'd developed creative solutions for making gatherings more accessible. "I think the restaurant we chose for Mom's birthday might be too loud," Emma had said during our planning conversation for the celebration. "Should we ask for a corner table away from the kitchen, or would it be better to have the party at home where Dylan and Dad can take breaks if they need to?" The consideration she was showing for Dylan's sensory needs represented a complete reversal from her previous attitude, and her efforts to include Dad's needs demonstrated that she understood autism as a family characteristic rather than an individual challenge. But the most significant change had been in how Dylan was perceived and included in family interactions. Instead of being treated as the family member who needed the most accommodation, he was increasingly recognized as the family member with the clearest understanding of relationship dynamics and emotional honesty. "Dylan, what do you think about the vacation plans we've been discussing?" Mom had asked during our most recent family meeting, genuinely seeking his input rather than just informing him about decisions that had been made without his perspective. "I think the beach house sounds good if it has quiet spaces where Grandpa and I can take breaks from social time," Dylan had replied thoughtfully. "But I think we should plan shorter days and longer quiet time so nobody gets overwhelmed." Mom. His suggestions had been incorporated into the final vacation plans, and other family members had commented on how much more enjoyable their trips had become when they'd followed Dylan's recommendations for balancing social time with restorative quiet time. The family photo that had been the site of so much drama had been replaced with a new tradition: annual pictures that were taken with consideration for everyone's comfort and needs. Instead of forced formal poses, we'd started taking candid photos during activities that felt natural and enjoyable for all family members. "I like these pictures better," Dylan had observed while looking through our photo album from recent gatherings. "Everyone looks actually happy instead of pretend happy." His distinction between genuine and performed happiness had become a family standard for evaluating whether our gatherings were successful. If Dylan and Dad looked genuinely comfortable and engaged, we knew we were creating inclusive experiences rather than just maintaining appearances. The most unexpected outcome of the entire experience had been Emma's transformation from Dylan's harshest critic to his most effective advocate. She'd used her experience with hiding secrets and managing shame to understand how family dynamics could be harmful to vulnerable members, and she'd committed to ensuring that Dylan never again experienced exclusion or criticism based on his neurological differences. "I spent years hiding parts of myself because I was afraid of judgment," Emma had said during one of our conversations about family growth and healing. "I don't want Dylan to ever feel like his authentic self is something that needs to be hidden or apologized for." The irony wasn't lost on any of us that Dylan, the family member who'd been called shameful, had been the catalyst for creating a family culture based on authenticity and acceptance rather than performance and judgment. "Dylan," I'd said during our bedtime conversation the night before his 9th birthday, "how do you feel about how our family treats you now compared to how they used to treat you?" "Better," Dylan had replied simply. "Now they like the real me, instead of wanting me to pretend to be someone else." "And how do you feel about being the person who helped everyone learn to be more honest with each other?" Dylan had thought about the question for several minutes, processing both the personal and family implications of his role in catalyzing change. "Good," he'd said finally. "Truth is better than pretending, even when truth is hard at first." As I'd tucked him into bed that night, I'd realized that my son's autism hadn't brought shame to our family. It had brought the gift of authentic relationship, an honest communication that had been missing for years. The child who supposedly didn't understand social dynamics had become the family member who understood them most clearly, and his commitment to truth over comfort had created the foundation for genuine healing and connection.